If you ever study literature related to the art of war, you'll realize that there are several aspects of that Ukraine has absolutely mastered. And in fact, the more you study it, the more you'll start to see Ukraine's strategy in their war against Russia as actually very, very proactive and not all that reactive unless they absolutely have to be reactive. The more you look at the actual battlefield, especially as it has played out over several years, it seems that Ukraine has had a lot of foresight and that they have actually guided events towards the conclusion that we are still driving towards today, but that has now gotten a whole lot closer and a whole lot clearer than it was several years ago. In fact, if you ever want a masterclass on strategy, it helps just to look back at what Ukraine has done and try to mimic that and unpack that as much as possible. In today's video, that's exactly what I want to do as we look at what appears to be Ukraine's strategy in and around Crimea. And I want to look at some principles that Ukraine seems to be adhering to rather brilliantly that might help other people understand what exactly Ukraine's goals around Crimea are and how Ukraine can actually, yes, eventually take Crimea back from Russia. There's, of course, a lot of principles we could look at, but two in particular have been standing out to me a lot lately. The first principle I find to be rather funny and rather pleasing to use and to analyze. And that principle is never interrupt your enemy while he is making a mistake, which explains a whole lot of what we see Ukraine doing across the board, but as you'll see today, especially around Crimea. And the second principle is to leave your opponent a golden bridge by which they can escape, or a golden bridge that they can retreat across. The concept here of the golden bridge is actually very important, and it's not just about being merciful, but rather the idea is that if your enemy feels backed into a corner, they are certain to fight, and not only are they certain to fight, they're certain to fight much more fiercely. And so when it comes to warfare, the best way to gather territory from your opponent is actually to give them a path to escape that territory and a credible reason that makes them feel like they actually have to. And it turns out that that is exactly the direction that Crimea is going, perhaps not in the short term, not in the immediate term, but absolutely in the long term. So as we dive into our discussion about Ukraine's strategy around Crimea, it will help to first level set on some of the basic facts about Crimea and the strategic importance of Crimea in general, because only then can we see the true brilliance of what Ukraine has actually been doing there and really why we should continue to support Ukraine's efforts until they are ultimately successful in the end. Now, I've been traveling a lot lately and living out of a suitcase. Some of you know that my son has been in the hospital, and I've been spending most of my nights there in one of the smallest rooms I've ever seen. He's doing pretty well now, by the way, but living out of a suitcase can be a challenge, especially when you're trying to pack as much gear as I do. Thankfully, though, I've been helped out a lot by Exter, one of my sponsors, who recently provided me with some gear that I've been using to make my travel a whole lot easier. First and foremost is their awesome travel vacuum bag, which has one of the best designs I've ever seen. This travel compression bag can fit up to 15 or more articles of clothing and compress them to the point that I have 60% more space in my suitcase. And for me, the best part is the super portable USB-C pump that is actually designed for travel and can be used 20 times on a single charge. So when I'm trying to get everything for a trip into just a backpack and to carry on, this thing is a game changer. Exter also sent me a brand new wallet. For a long time, I have personally already been using an Exter wallet, and I don't really see myself ever using a different wallet again. In fact, all of my local family actually carries Exter wallets or Exter card holders. These wallets have a spot for everything you need, and they also have a super satisfying click mechanism that makes it easy to access all my cards. They also can pair with the most aesthetically pleasing accessories, like this GPS Finder card that lets me track and even ping my wallet if I ever have trouble finding it. Right now, through September 16th, Exter is having their Labor Day sale, where you can get up to 48% off site-wide. And you can also unlock an additional 10% off by using the code Paul Warburg. So go take a look and get some gear to match the stuff that I personally carry every day. And thanks again to Exter for sponsoring today's video. Crimea is, of course, a very important piece of territory, and it's very important strategically from a military and defense standpoint, but it's also very important geopolitically, nationally, when it comes to the thinking and the mindset of both Ukrainians and Russians. There's a reason that this is a disputed piece of territory in the first place, and that's because both Ukrainians and Russians want it. And it's a very complex piece of territory when it comes to Ukraine actually taking it back. Again, for both military reasons, but also for nationalistic and geopolitical type reasons. The main complexity here comes down to the fact that when Russia took Crimea from Ukraine back in 2014, they very intentionally moved a very large group of ethnic Russians onto the Crimean Peninsula to make it a humanitarian crisis in the international perspective if Ukraine ever took this piece of territory back. Meaning that Russia has preceded Crimea with propaganda narratives that they are just waiting to use against Ukraine if indeed the peninsula does fall at a moment of Russian weakness. It is kind of a brilliant strategy when we consider how Russian propaganda works and how much they think in terms like this, and that does guide Ukraine's military strategy and how they think about not only how they take the Crimean Peninsula back, but also the timing at which they do so. So with that idea very importantly now seated, let's put it on the shelf for now and come back and revisit it later in the video when we can put everything together. And let's now move to talking about the other aspects that make Crimea such a complicated piece of territory when it comes to recapturing it, which are the military aspects owing to the complex geographical positioning of Crimea. Crimea, of course, for all intents and purposes, might as well be an island. It is technically a peninsula, it is a peninsula, but it is only barely a peninsula with a very small land bridge to the rest of the Ukrainian mainland. This land bridge is part of what makes Crimea so difficult to assault, because it means that there are very limited access points onto the peninsula. Really, there is only the Kerch Strait Bridge in the east, and then the actual peninsula in the west. And these are choke points that make it very easy for Russia to, for example, set up defenses here, set up mines, pre-target artillery, things like that, and just really rain hell on any army that was going to try to cross over there. And that makes it almost impossible for Ukraine to conduct a land invasion or any kind of invasion against Crimea with the size of military that they currently have, especially when they're so occupied along the front that they currently have. And if Ukraine did do this, it would be at the cost of many, many casualties, perhaps more casualties than most people would think was worth it. This makes people feel very confident, for example, that Ukraine can never take Crimea back. However, what a lot of people neglect is that the very aspects that make Crimea so easy to defend also make it incredibly vulnerable under siege conditions. They make it very vulnerable over the long term, over a long period of time, although they make it very durable over the short term. And so now we've explained the nationalistic aspects of Crimea and also the military geographical aspects of Crimea, and we see how both of these pieces point towards a strategy to recapture Crimea that thinks in very long term. Here then is where we approach a conundrum. Most of the Western world does not seem to think that Ukraine is fighting a long war. Most of the Western world seems to think that Ukraine wants to end their war against Russia as quickly as possible. And of course, they do want the war to be over. But people mistake Ukraine wanting the war to be over with Ukraine being desperate for the war to be over. And most people think that Ukraine is fighting a short-term war, when in reality, every single piece of Ukraine's strategy that we can actually analyze shows that Ukraine is indeed planning for the long term, and that is exactly the case here on Crimea, where, as I've said, Ukraine is very explicitly not interrupting their opponent while they're making a mistake, and leaving a golden bridge for the enemy to retreat across. So first, let's look at not interrupting your enemy while they're making a mistake, which I think really sums up a whole lot of what Ukraine has been doing against Crimea. If you look at what Ukraine has done to Crimea, it's been rather interesting, where early on in the war, Crimea became a massive target for Ukraine. They started destroying everything around Crimea they could, whether that be air defenses, whether that be especially the Russian Navy, any types of military assets in and around Crimea, making Russia really terrified that they might actually lose control of the peninsula in a lot of ways. Ukraine also conducted a lot of early strikes on the Kerch Strait Bridge, one of the few access points onto Crimea, but notably they did not destroy the bridge. However, they were successful in making the Russian military scared enough that they no longer actually transport military equipment across that bridge. Instead, the Russian military now transports basically all of their military equipment that's destined for Crimea through the Donbas region, through occupied Ukrainian territory, where from other types of targets, these shipments are actually a whole lot more vulnerable, but at least they won't completely disappear if the bridge goes down. And this has really cost Russia a lot of resources. It has also bogged up supply lines that could be taking supplies to other parts of the front, and it has made Russia think a lot more complicated when it comes to logistics. However, since then, a lot of people have noticed kind of an interesting trend in Ukrainian strikes against Crimea. And the trend is that Ukraine will hit a lot of targets on Crimea in big bursts. They'll take out a lot of air defense, they'll take out a base or two maybe. Typically, they'll take out an area with a military commander and it'll make big headlines, and then Ukraine will stop for a while. And Ukraine will give Russia enough time to largely rebuild what has been destroyed, and then they will go and they will strike again in a big burst, and they will take out a lot of, again, usually Russian air defenses around Crimea. And here what we see appears to be Ukraine exploiting Russian psychology and exploiting the nationalistic aspects of Crimea to turn things as much in their favor as possible. Basically, because Crimea is seen as such an important piece of territory to the Russians, they just can't let it sit with the appearance of being undefended. And that means that every time Ukraine destroys military fortifications here, they know that Russia will invest resources in rebuilding those fortifications, even if from a strategic perspective it actually makes no sense. It's very vitally important to the Russian government that the people on Crimea feel like they are being protected by the Russian government, and that the people within the rest of Russia feel like Crimea is being protected by the Russian government. So Russia will keep reinvesting in these same destroyed air defense systems to give the aura of protection, although obviously it is just an aura, because if your air defense system keeps getting destroyed by air-based attack methods, it's really not such an effective defense mechanism. But it does make the Russians feel better when the Russian military is constantly investing resources in the defense of this piece of territory. Ukraine then knows that they can essentially bleed Russia dry over the long term. Every time they destroy something on Crimea, Russia will reinvest in rebuilding it, and that again removes resources from the rest of the battle lines in Russia, where they could potentially be used even more, and it also continues to spread Russian defenses more thinly, just in general across the entire country. Furthermore, as long as Crimea remains an intact target, and a target that is continually being struck, it remains a target that occupies the mind space of Russian leaders and Russian generals. Whenever they are thinking about another area of the front line, they have to also invest resources in the defense of Crimea. And that actually means that, contrary to popular belief, the longer that Crimea remains Russian, the better it actually is for Ukraine, at least until they're reaching those end stages of the war where they're actually making a concerted effort to take that territory back. And again, that will probably be a long game, because Ukraine does not want to assault Crimea with a bunch of land-based troops. They don't want to have a massive meat assault like Russia does. They don't want to lose a lot of men trying to take this target. They would rather take it through other means. And that comes back now to the other strategy that Ukraine has been using on Crimea, which is leaving your opponent a golden bridge to retreat across. This has begun to make a lot of news again recently, because Ukraine has recently developed their Flamingo cruise missile, and now a lot of people are talking about how Ukraine can use this cruise missile to finally do something that people think they've been trying to do since the start of the war, which is to destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge. People say now Ukraine has this ability, they can pack a mighty punch, they can hit from a long range, and the bridge is finally going to come down, and that could be true. But I think that Ukraine has actually not been unsuccessful when it comes to the Kerch Strait Bridge, but they've actually been very successful up to this point in the war, and they will continue to be successful with the bridge intact, where it is actually more valuable to them than if the bridge is destroyed. What's interesting about Ukrainian attacks on the Kerch Strait Bridge up to this point is that they have actually hit the bridge several times in several different ways, and they have actually destroyed certain segments of the bridge at points in the past as well. And a lot of people have said, well, Ukraine failed because Ukraine did not take down the bridge in the way of actually cutting the link between Russia and Crimea. But a lot of people don't realize that that might not actually be Ukraine's goal. Ukraine's goal might not be to actually take out the bridge, but merely to signal that they could take out the bridge. Because if you are a Russian who has been planted on Crimea by your government, and you are now sensing, for example, that Ukrainian forces might move on to Crimea very soon, and that your only lifeline back to Russia without going through occupied territory that's basically a military combat zone is over this bridge. If that bridge keeps getting attacked to where you think it could get destroyed any day, that is going to ramp up the speed that you actually leave Crimea. And Ukraine's continued signaling, not just with one method of attack, but with several methods of attack, that not only can we hit the Kerch Strait Bridge, but we can hit it in several ways, now including the Flamingo cruise missile, is, I think, actually probably more intended to influence the psychology of the average Russian living on Crimea. Because again, you have to realize that Ukraine is thinking about the implanted strategic element within Crimea, which is the built-in propaganda mechanism that Russia made sure to put there. Ukraine knows that Crimea has to be their last target in the war, because the moment that Ukraine actually takes Crimea back, Russia will again ramp up their propaganda efforts within Western media that they have been very successful at to make Ukraine look like a villain. Ukraine knows that they basically need to wait until they have gotten all of the support they need from Western countries before they actually take Crimea back. And in the meantime, they also want to reduce the effect of this propaganda by having as few implanted Russians left on Crimea as possible when and if they actually do take the peninsula. So again, no surprise, but Ukraine is playing the long game. They've studied the art of war. They have thought about what is in their best interests, and they realize that it's in their best interests now for Russia to hold Crimea as long as possible until it's the very last target. That does not mean that Ukraine cannot take Crimea back. It simply means that they are being smart about the way they do it. And if you want to learn more about that, I've covered other aspects of this and other videos on this same topic, which you can check out in the description. If you appreciated this analysis, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Those things are both completely free, but they help me out a lot. And if you want to help support me even more, there are a number of links in the description by which you can do so. It's all completely optional, of course. I don't expect paid support from anybody, but I really do appreciate it. It really does help keep me going and helps me post more frequent videos with higher quality analysis and also higher quality audio and visuals and things like that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.